Well, it's my privilege to introduce to you our next speaker, Dr. Rebeccah Heinrichs, is Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute, where she directs their Keystone Defense Initiative. Most recently, she's the author of Duty to Deter, a Just War Defense of American Nuclear Deterrence. So without further ado, everyone please welcome Rebeccah Heinrichs.
I think Mark said that if we start a little early, we might leave a little earlier, but I intend to take up all of the time. So I just got a few extra minutes with you all in my hope that I will leave plenty of time for Q&A, which is my favorite part because it gives me the opportunity to answer the questions that you are all considering, as you've already had a day and a half of great talks and food for thought at this wonderful conference. So thank you so much, Mark, for inviting me here again today. I love this group, and so nobody is doing what Thule and his crew are doing, and it's an enormous value and asset to our country and beyond. And so I'm incredibly thankful and privileged to be a speaker once again here at this event. Okay, so if you are taking notes, this is my first big point. As a good Baptist, I'm going to lay out some outline here for you. For at least that's the way we do our sermons at Capitol Hill Baptist Church here in D.C. So the first point is this. I think this is really important that we get this right because I in an age of populism where things are dynamic and questions are being asked of things that used to be sort of taken for granted as bipartisan consensus or assumptions that professional national security or diplomats kind of agreed on. As years have passed on, it's become increasingly clear that those professionals have failed to interrogate those primary assumptions and then make the case for what they're doing. And so it's because of that failure of the professional class to make their case, and then because of that, they've sort of become haughty and I think hubristic in then what they're doing, and so there's some misunderstanding, and I think between the American people and what the professional class is doing. But not only is there a misunderstanding, but I would say that the professional class is in many ways at odds with what the American people actually believe are their interests and are the right thing for the United States to do to exercise American power prudently and virtuously. And so I want to get back. I think it's incumbent upon all of us who are going to be making arguments for what the United States should and should not do with our resources and our power to make the case for what it is that we're trying to defend, what we believe is the fundamental purpose of the federal government's power that the American people, as sovereign in our democratic republic, have permitted those in power to use for their defense. So here's the first point. The most powerful nation economically and militarily is the nation that will have the most influence in the world. Okay? That has always been true. The country that is the most powerful economically and militarily is the nation that will have the most influence in the world. Every American should want that to be the United States. So even if you are really mad at our current government and the bipartisan consensus for how they've used it, if you look at who the alternative is, it's bad for us, okay? It's China, and it's leading an axis with the Russians, the Iranians, and the North Koreans. So you should want your country to have the most power, and we derive that power from our economic engine and our military. The U.S.-led international order and the values it upholds are at risk from the Chinese and the Russian authoritarian regimes. I am now quoting from the Bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission, on which I had the privilege of serving as one of the Republican appointed commissioners. That just means I was appointed there by Chairman Mike Rogers, who's a Republican and the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. So this report was this commission was was sort of conceived of by Democrats and Republicans in the Congress who said, listen, we haven't had a bipartisan effort to look at what the U.S. strategic posture, so when I say U.S. strategic posture, I'm talking about our nuclear forces and the non-nuclear forces that complement our nuclear forces. We haven't had a bipartisan look, a fresh look, since the 2008-2009 Strategic Posture Commission. And a lot has changed since then. So let's put some folks in this bipartisan effort to take a look at that. And it's amazing that we came up with a bipartisan, really nonpartisan, consensus document. And part of what we explained was in the opening section. Before we even got to the threats, we talked about what's at stake. And so that quote is from that. So it's what's at stake, it's the US-led international order and the values it upholds. And so then here, I'm going to spend some time explaining what now speaking just personally as Rebeccah, no longer a consensus participant of the Strategic Posture Commission. It's very hard to get consensus, and I treat it as a precious thing. And so now I'm speaking only as myself, because I'm sure that my colleagues would not agree with every single thing I'm about to say here. But this is, I think, important as I understand it here. So what is the U.S. international order, the U.S.-led international order? Notice I did not say the liberal, rules-based international order. I did not say that. I said the U.S.-led international order. What is it? This order is the post-World War II order, wherein the U.S. is the strongest power economically and militarily, and it is one in which the U.S. and its allies enforce the norms and rules that serve our collective interests. What are those norms? Free and open sea lanes for peaceful commerce. The peaceful use of global commons beyond the oceans. So now we're not just talking about commerce, we're talking about seabeds. What's on those seabeds? Internet cables, of which the PRC has been cutting, connecting it to Taiwan, for instance. Or the cable that goes from Finland to Estonia that recently was cut. It was an energy pipeline. We have a Finn here who can confirm that for me. And it got almost no press because this was happening since Russia's last full-scale invasion of Ukraine post-2022. And there was a cable cut on the seabed. And you know what ship was up there? There was really two ships side by side, a Russian flagged ship and a Hong Kong/Chinese flagged ship up there. And it was a Chinese flagged ship with an anchor on the bottom that it dragged to and fro along the seabed, cutting that cable. What has the, quote, international community done about that? Nothing. It has done nothing. The Chinese have said it was bad weather. Objectively speaking, there was no bad weather. The Finns have the anchor. The Estonians have the anchor. So it was an anchor that was dragged. Okay, so the peaceful use of trade, commerce, seabeds, peaceful use of those seabeds for that nobody owns the international waters, peaceful use of outer space, the security of internationally recognized physical national borders, that is Israel, borders are recognized of what it is. Ukraine has borders that we recognize what they are. Estonia has physical borders. The United States of America, despite what our current immigration status looks like, we do have physical borders, if only we would defend them. The sovereignty of intellectual property, necessary for free and fair trade and relations between responsible nations. This is what we're defending when we talk about the US-led international order. This system has resulted in unprecedented, enormous peace and unprecedented, enormous human prosperity and the protection of the American way of life. You want your free speech, you better want the United States to be the preeminent power and not China. You want free and fair trade, you better believe it's got to be the United States controlling those sea lanes and not the Chinese Communist Party. From 1800 to the present day, 37 million people globally have died in wars. Of those, 75% have died in wars before this world international order was created by the United States, winning with our allies the Second World War. Enormous peace and prosperity. So what is the US-led international order not? It is not a system that relinquishes US sovereignty to international bodies. We are not a party to the International Criminal Court for a reason. Here, the people govern. It is the consent of the governed. And so we do not submit our own sovereignty to an international criminal court that does not have the consent of the governed, and of course, nor does it share US understanding of due process and the principles of which our entire system of justice is built upon. It is not, again, the US-led order is not a memoranda as a substitute for no-kidding outcomes. NATO might be patting itself on the back for another communique or the fact that NATO is still is still the greatest political military alliance ever created. I agree with that. But I would argue that NATO is taking too many victory laps for what it has provided to Ukraine. It might agree to some communications, it might agree with some political statements, but I would argue there are some fundamental problems with the way the alliance is currently delivering on what it should. It is not merely the existence of the UN, as made very obvious again and again by the failure of the UN interim force in Lebanon, which has sided with Hezbollah in its genocidal war against Israel by permitting Hezbollah to reconstitute and to exist in carrying out its terrorist activities against Israel. So if you hear people defending the rules-based international order and they point to the UN as the guarantor of this system, I would point out where the UN continues to fail. Why has the UN not denounced and implemented more sanctions against the North Korean regime for violating agreed upon Security Council resolutions in the last several years? It cannot, because China and Russia forbid it. It is not merely the existence of free trade agreements that enable our enemies to get strong at our expense. The WTO gifting China with most favored nation status has not liberalized the nation of China. The Chinese Communist Party has not become a Jeffersonian democracy as it has been integrated into the global economy. It is now a wealthy Chinese communist state using its wealth based on a system that we created in the principles of capitalism and free trade, and it has used it to build a military designed to target the United States and break the US-led order. It is not merely the existence of treaties that countries like Russia systematically cheat on, while we, the United States, abide by them at our expense and to the great advantage of the Russians, of the Chinese, of the Iranians, and of North Korea. I'll give you an example of that. In the last administration, there was lots of distressed outcry when President Trump withdrew the United States from the JCPOA, that is the Iran nuclear deal. And there was cries of this was the end, this is sort of unraveling of the international rules-based order. Well, the JCPOA enriched the Iranian regime without dismantling their program or stopping delivery systems, which are hand-in-glove part of their nuclear program. And it enriched the regime to carry out its terrorist activities throughout the Middle East. And so that particular agreement did not serve the outcomes it was supposed to serve, and it undermined the United States and our security. Take also the INF Treaty. The INF Treaty banned, during the Cold War, intermediate nuclear and conventional forces that are ground launch systems in Europe. The Russians have been cheating on them since at least 2014 on that treaty. The Obama administration did not pull out of the treaty because it kept trying again and again to get the Russians to comply, and they believed that that treaty still served our interests. Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party was building up a missile force, over 90% of its missile force would have violated the INF Treaty had it been party to it. It was fundamentally at odds with US security interests. And so withdrawing from that treaty, as President Trump did, was right and good. Rules-based order notwithstanding. What about the Open Skies Treaty? President Trump withdrew from that. Why? The Russians were using it to their advantage in a way it was never meant to be designed to spy on what the United States was doing in our command and control. And they were prohibiting US overflights over key regions of which we wanted to see what the Russians were doing. It did not serve our interests, so the United States withdrew. I can think of another one. So WHO, there was World Trade, let's say World Health Organization. Another organization designed by the United States and our allies to have some understanding for responsible and collective good behavior for global health. That is a good thing. But the WHO has been completely overtaken by corruption and by individuals that serve the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. You could see this during the COVID pandemic, when you had Taiwan that was begging the world to understand what it knew early on in the conflict, but of which it's not permitted to be a member of the WHO. Okay, so what must we do? Well, first, we must defend the US-led international order. So even though I just outlined all of the things that are not going well, that does not mean that I think we should destroy it. Why? Because the first point I made, the country that is the strongest power economically and militarily will be the country that influenced the world most effectively. So we should not disband with the US-led international order. It will be replaced by another powerful country that will design a world order in which it serves its ends and its national goals. So we can defend it. So that's my third point. So first point of what it is, second point, we must defend it, and I'll get back to why that is. But third point, we can defend it. So I will have a lot of people who will agree with everything I just said, and then they will say, Rebeccah, it's too hard. We have squandered the end of the Cold War, which American power was at its apex. We have squandered it. We have squandered it with unendless wars, without clear objectives. We have squandered it by permitting China into the WTO, with giving it most favored nation status. We're now too reliant on China. We have squandered it by fighting low-intensity conflict at the expense of preparing to deter and win if deterrence fails against major powers. We have squandered it by letting our defense industrial base atrophy. It is too late. To which I say, it's not, but we also don't have a choice. Okay? The alternative is subjugation, of which I am completely unwilling to accept. So, what must we do? Well, the United States possesses 25% of global GDP compared to China and Russia's combined 20%. And now I'm pulling from an op-ed that Matthew Kranig and I co-wrote, I think last year for National Review, so you can go and read that whole article. If one adds formal treaty allies to the equation, the free world possesses nearly 60% of global GDP, a clear preponderance of economic heft. We have that. We have it. We have the best military in the world. Now, that is not something we can take for granted. We've got some major problems, but we still have the most capable, most effective military. So one of the most undiscussed, underappreciated aspects of the U.S. Effort with our allies to enable Ukraine to defend itself and push the Russians off its territory is that part of the reason, and I don't want to take away anything from what the Ukrainians have been able to do to fight for their own country, it is a marvel what the Ukrainians have been able to do versus the Russian military. And they have been willing to sacrifice enormous blood and treasure to defend the sovereignty of their country. But you can see what the United States, the extent that we do help in providing intelligence, in providing training, in providing real-time ability to do some of their battlefield assessments, that these aren't even our best weapons. We are sending them our old weapons. And talk to the Ukrainians, they'll tell you, some of them don't work. But it's American ingenuity, it's American technology that has, without even being in the fight directly, that has enabled this country to defend itself. Imagine if the United States was actually in the fight. Russia doesn't want that. Let me put it more specifically. Putin doesn't want that. Putin doesn't want that. Putin understands that if the United States led NATO to fight Russia, it would be an awful, terrible war of which we must deter, but Russia would lose. So, we must we must rebuild the defense industrial base. The defense industrial base is very simply our ability, the United States' ability to produce weapons at scale and quickly. That's what it is. So if you start looking at just the number of munitions we have total sort of on standby, that's not necessarily what I'm talking about. That's part of it, but I'm talking about our ability to reconstitute our forces and produce weapons at scale. Our support for Ukraine has begun to reboot the defense industrial base. And our initial assessments back in 2022 about what the United States could be able to provide Ukraine, we've actually been way better at that. Our ability as a country to say, okay, what do we need to do to go faster? And to do things like give the Department of Defense direct acquisition authority to contractors like Boeing. They say, we need a weapon system that can do this, go figure it out. When we have done that and gone outside the sluggish bureaucracy that has sort of built up and calcified since the Cold War, we have been able to go very fast. The Boeing company took not to get too technical, but it took a weapon system that we only deliver from fighter aircraft early on in the war before Ukraine really had any kind of air force to speak of at all. It had no use for a weapon system like that. And Boeing was able to take that particular weapon system and make it ground launched and deliver it into Ukraine within like 6 or 7 weeks. That's just one example. So there is enormous potential and ability for the United States to go fast when there is the political will to do it. We can come up with solutions. A lot of the things that make this country slow and make our acquisition process cumbersome are our own doing. Not only has the defense industrial base shrunk since the Cold War, but our environmental and contracting regulations have grown. So if you can go back, if you had a country that has the political will to go defend what is ours and what makes the United States strong, you can go through an audit and cut out a lot of this stuff and see how fast we can go. We must defend it by restoring the organizations that harm us. So I mentioned the WHO. I argued during the Trump administration, the United States of America should pull out of the WHO, should defund it. And then I'll get people to say, well, okay, Rebeccah, but then we're going to be out of the World Health game. No, we're not. Start a new one. Make Taiwan the first member. Start a new one. Every country that can provide good information to help public health, of which it doesn't execute its own scientists and doctors when they come forward with good public health, gets to join. You see how quickly the United States can steward its resources, its diplomatic leverage to have a World Health Organization that actually works for the American people and provides good public health for us and our allies. And I want to call it the what. So I want to get out of the who and I want to get into the what. I have not been able to come up with what that acronym would actually mean. So I'm taking suggestions. And we must defend it by returning to a public diplomacy that embraces the American principles that the order successfully was built upon and unite Americans. This one might be my most controversial hot take, but I believe it is vital. There are some who would say that the international order that I just laid out, the US-led international order, has essentially been undermining us because it is indistinguishable from the wokeism, the progressivism that's coming out of higher education. That what America is promoting as US interests is essentially not distinguishable from a lot of the radical, frankly, Marxist ideology coming out of higher education. And that deserves its own speech, but I'm only here to say there is a lot of truth to that. You can look at what the State Department, what CIA, what our military training, see what they're doing to prioritize their mission. We must have a return, it's really much closer to the post-World War II world order, in which we are putting forward American principles and values that we push to the world and we showcase to the world that Americans can unite behind, even at this time of great division. What are they? Well, they're the principles in the Declaration of Independence. Based on the dignity of the human person, dynamic democratic government where there is accountability to the government. The people do not live to serve the government. The government is there to serve human beings, the citizens of that specific country. And free and fair trade, property rights as a subsequent policy that is derivative of that first principle of the dignity of the human person. You start putting forward those and just ensuring that the only flag that we put on any embassy and that we put on maybe you can have some McDonald's. McDonald's is a good symbolism of sort of like American capitalism, but not on an embassy. But it should be the American flag. The American flag is the great unifier. It is the most fundamental representation of what the United States stands for. It is the most anti-racist. It is the most pro-woman. This is the American flag. Okay, so that needs to be a return. We are toast if we want to do all of these things without getting that part right. And then I'll just sort of conclude here. So we must have an aggressive embrace of what the United States really stands for, and it's a merit-based society, right? Based on equal opportunity under the law. So we must do this. We must do this because we have entered an era of extreme danger, of which China is contesting the United States economically and militarily, and is on a very intentional path to undo America's alliance architecture, because Xi Jinping understands that what the US-led international order is, most concretely, is our system of alliances. That's what it is. And so it is targeting those. And he is doing those with the collaboration of the Russian government, the North Korean government, and the Iranian government. So in conclusion, we are really at the cusp of, I think, losing what all of us have had the enormous privilege of growing up in and inheriting. And we have the responsibility and we have the duty to understand what has given us the enormous prosperity and freedom that all of us enjoy. And despite all of our differences at home, we must unite together to come up with a bipartisan effort to save, restore, and rebuild American preeminence and to defend the US-led order. Thank you. And I can explain. I'd love to take questions now. I do want to say that this is partly why my book is really only a piece of this. The sort of the summary of the thesis of the book that I wrote is that when you boil it all down, where is the greatest source, no kidding, of American power? And it's our nuclear deterrent. Our nuclear deterrent permits the United States to make good on its alliances, to extend power abroad, to defend international commerce, and to protect those things that really make up for most concretely the US-led international order. And so I argue that it is not only in our interest for the United States to adapt the deterrent to make sure that it is credible, but that it is our moral duty to do it. And the way the United States does it by targeting what the adversary values, which in totalitarian regimes, it's not its people, it's not cities, It's its military forces and that which keeps their regimes in power and keeps control of their populations, that's what the United States needs to build, a nuclear deterrent in order to hold those things at risk, and then a missile defense system that protects our ability to do that in our own innocent Americans. And so I try to make that argument based on the Just War document in about 130 pages. And so I feel like I don't do the subject total justice at all, but it's a really, I think, good and necessary start so people can think clearly about what our nuclear weapons are for and how they're different than how our adversaries use theirs. So with that, happy to take questions. Yeah, right here. Ladies first, always.
Hello, my name is actually also Rebeccah, and I'm from Patrick Henry College. I have a question about kind of a third aspect of a way I think China is sort of trying to take over the United States, in addition to military and economic, which you touched on. But that's cultural, like soft launch, into media, Hollywood, even TikTok. How do you think American policymakers can kind of combat that aspect of Chinese influence in American society in our efforts to maintain our cultural dignity and sovereignty?
Thank you so much for asking that question, because I want to clarify. It's the country that has the military and economic relative strength that gives their ability to do all of those things. So what I don't mean to say it's only the military and economic domains that give it it's what I want to say. It's their economy and their military that enables them to have that influence. So it is cultural influence, it is technology influence, it is Hollywood influence, it is our big sports leagues, it's all of those things. But the only reason China has the ability to silence American companies is because we are so sideways with the Chinese Communist Party right now, economically and militarily. We're in a serious competition, and the United States does not have sufficient relative to preeminence over them to make that not the case. Does that make sense? And so, I mean, if you see American investors, and it's only getting worse with Xi Jinping's rise. The longer Xi Jinping is in power, the more problematic this becomes. I mean, there are Chinese American businessmen who are inside China and are not allowed to leave China right now. You had the China Commission in Congress really tried to raise Cain about this. The last time I think Anthony Blinken went to China to have some sort of negotiations with Chinese leaders. And the reason that China can get away with that is because you have to have leverage to make them not do that. They're not going to stop doing it based on the benevolence of Marxist-Leninism. Doesn't exist. And so your point is so. I mean, I would argue you have to get the hard power piece right. If the United States, the United States is not going to have the courage and the leverage at the UN if it doesn't have the ability to protect its allies, make good on its security commitments, and contest the Chinese and the Russians. It's not. And so you have to get that no kidding hard power piece of which our power is derived in order for us then to push back culturally and all these other ways that you mentioned. I definitely think that the United States should not be quiet about those things. I mean, I am a big proponent of, Xi Jinping is toast if the Chinese people push back on what he's doing. There's too many of them. And so the United States should be demanding, you want to be able to beam in your Chinese communist propaganda via X, then fine. We want the same thing. Let's let the National Review and Providence and Washington Examiner and the Washington Free Beacon, let us beam our news into China. That's not allowed. That is not allowed. So I would be demanding reciprocity, for instance. I would not be letting them just spew their propaganda into the United States, which divides Americans, amplifies the worst things going on in this country on our social media accounts. I mean, I can feel myself getting mad at what I'm seeing, and then more mad when I realize I'm only seeing it because it was a Chinese troll that put it in front of my face on my X account, And so it is, and that's somebody who understands what's even going on. I can see the information warfare. A lot of Americans have no idea that they're on platforms that are being used to subvert us. And so anyway, we should use our great advantage of free speech, robust debate, and we should use that to our advantage to get it into these countries. And these regimes, I mean, we need to stop being on our back foot and be on our forward foot and say we have a lot more going for us than what you permit us to let or what we are willing to exercise. And one of them is information and culture, and with that culture. I could go on. There's other things. I mean, American companies cannot divest in China unless they're forced to, because they're capitalists, and they're going to be thinking about how to get rich. And if their competitors are staying in China, then they're afraid to leave China. Now it's becoming an increasingly toxic place to do business anyway. So I mean, the Chinese Communist Party is kind of helping us to that, but it's going to be too slow. So I'm actually in favor of the federal government actually making it very, very dangerous and even more toxic and dangerous, and for companies to continue to invest overly in China, especially for key things that are of enormous national importance for the United States. There's no reason we should still be having our key pharmaceuticals made in China. That is insane, for instance. So anyway, great question. Yeah.
McGregor Langston, Regent University. So one of the big obstacles to American power, it seems like, especially in the national security sphere, is that our industrial base has been so hollowed out. And I mean, in World War II, that was our superpower, was our ability to produce not only enough for ourselves, but for our allies as well. But now we see we've offshored so many industries, we don't even have the infrastructure anymore. And on top of that, we don't even have kids my age wanting to take jobs in industrial base related fields. And so we don't have people that are gonna build ships and planes and things like that. Do you have any thoughts about how we're gonna improve our industrial base to ensure those goals?
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is our public schools are teaching kids that our country stinks, and why would you go do something to defend it anyway? I mean, why, if we had a public school system that's teaching kids that, listen, there's no real difference between the United States and China anyway. We're systemically racist, we're systemically misogynistic, and we've made the world worse. And look at our allies. Our allies are, these terrible countries, and look how they're behaving, and so it's not worth defending. And maybe China's efficient, and look at it. It's the world's most sophisticated, technologically advanced, robotic, blah, blah, blah nation ever, and it's brought all these people out of poverty, and it's so great. And so maybe it's time for them to rule. I mean, I say that flippantly and mockingly, and that is actually, though, legitimately what some people argue. So that's a problem. So I mean, that's a sort of like a really pulling, the curtains back and figuring out how to fix this. But the good news is there's already states that are doing this. Some states are requiring, civic education, all those kinds of things, because right now you have public schools that are indoctrinating kids against loving their own country. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, this is why I'm a little bit more, I'm a political conservative, sort of small c, but I have been much more sort of interested and curious about industrial policy. Now that makes some of the more libertarian-minded people look at me like I'm some heretic. But one of the things I say is like, listen, capitalism is not an end of itself. Capitalism serves the interests of the American people for the freedom, security, and prosperity of the American family. So if we don't have a strong American nation, we're toast. And you can go down, subjugated by the Chinese Communist Party going, but Ayn Rand. It's like, she was wrong. So I think that I'm in favor, and I'm curious about some of these ideas about, good industrial policy. I think Build Back Better should be all about the American industrial base. Yes, build back better, build back better. Let's go. We can imagine a national recruiting effort to compete with Silicon Valley, or to work with Silicon Valley to say, what can we do with you to use the best innovation? Because there's all kinds of, the defense industrial base may have atrophied, but we've got all kinds of innovation. We have all kinds of innovation happening. One of the things, you love him or hate him, Elon Musk is eating the government's lunch on space launch. I tell people, I want the United States to have a space-based missile defense architecture proliferated with these satellites that have a kill capability so that we can intercept enemy missiles coming at us, so that we can have something like Israel's Iron Dome, but for the American homeland. And they look at me and they say, Rebecca, the United States can't launch satellites cheaply enough to make that make sense. And I say, but Elon can. Elon can, he's doing it. So it is possible. It is technologically possible. But we need to look to see what has created an environment in which anybody outside the government is coming up with these new emerging technologies, and they can use them for all kinds of things. But the Department of Defense has been shackled by too many just restrictions and bureaucracy and desire to just have a system for the sake of itself rather than being outcome oriented. There is no reason that Kim Jong-un gets to test missiles nonstop to improve his capability at a rate that should make us embarrassed. We have got to get back to testing and testing and testing and not being afraid to fail, because we're going to learn from those tests. And we got to have a hypersonic offensive and defensive capability because our adversaries have them. We are so afraid to test because we're so afraid to fail. We got to get out of that. So anyway, I think if you had the right American leadership, you could say, yeah, I recognize all these problems. I totally agree with you. But I refuse to just submit that this is just an unchangeable problem. The United States has the ability to educate Americans such that we have the practical ability to produce these a manufacturing base that defends the nation. The really hard part, though, and this is why Xi Jinping and Putin, they think their systems of government, their authoritarian system of government, are better than ours, because we have this big country that relies on our ability to convince one another. It's based on consensus rules. It makes it really hard. We're designed. The founders and their brilliance made it really hard to make big changes because they wanted us to have consensus. But that means we just got to get at it. We just have to work hard to do it. But that's all. I can go on. I was super excited about when I watched. Did anybody watch the Olympics? Just real quick. Okay, we are still producing the best Olympians. And it's like, I looked at this and I'm like, America is so awesome. And like I was going crazy over the medal count and stuff too, like every night, because I was like, oh my word, we have to beat the Chinese communists. But it's really wasn't even as close as it seemed. They have 1.5 billion people, and they drive their people like, the world's most sophisticated techno-authoritarian nation, and they hurt their little kids who, if they're not performing right, and we get up there and it's like every single one of our athletes is like, I just was laughing the whole time because they all just sounded like Americans in an American system that values their own wellness. And it's a totally different system, and we still produced better athletes. And anyway, I was just very excited about the Olympics. So, yeah.
So I apologize if this is not best worded. I'm Madeline. I'm from ACU. And you mentioned a couple times that you want to kind of build up the American industrial complex, the military, things like that, and that we should pull out of organizations like WHO and focus more on alliances that are for our benefit. Obviously, we're going to have a lot of allies in particularly Europe. They're not going to be super excited about that. And you mentioned that if we ended up in a war with Russia, we would almost assuredly win. But I'm not 100% sure I want to live in a world where we've gone to a full-on war with Russia. So how would you propose, we have kind of a continuously more negative view of ourselves overseas and things like that. How would you propose living in a world with allies that are sort of drifting away from us without alienating them completely, because I would say that's probably something we can't afford to do. And then also, how would you propose building up the American military so much without putting us in a position where we end up in World War III? And I say that as someone who mostly agrees with you, but I just want to hear how you...
Great. No, I think it's a great question, and you articulated that very, very well. So I would say, one, our adversaries are already going as fast as they can to challenge the United States in their respective regions, so in Europe and in the Pacific. So I disagree that the United States building up our defense industrial base is going to provoke a war. The best way we can prevent a war, my book is called Duty to Deter. We have had an enormous collapse of deterrence over the last 3.5+ years. So I want to get us back. I do not want to go to war with Russia. I do not want to go to war with China. I do not want to go to war with these countries. I want to make that very, very clear. My argument is This is always about a game of stakes. Who is willing to defend what they believe is more important to them, country-wise? My argument is we have enormously high stakes. The U.S. American way of life, the American way of life is on the line. So my argument is building up the defense industrial base and then collaborating with allies, and then I argued posturing our forces differently to regain deterrence is our best bet at preserving peace and not going to war. So if you look at what the last 3.5 years, it's been the United States trying, kind of stepping back, trying to de-escalate, and what has happened? Has the adversary de-escalated and stepped back? Absolutely not. The Chinese are way more belligerent, way more aggressive against the United States and allied forces. The Russians have not returned U.S. restraint. Again, the U.S. has restrained Ukraine. The U.S. has restrained Israel. Thankfully, the Israelis are increasingly not listening to the United States. It's a shame for the United States that I have to say that, but it's true. The United States has tried to restrain Israel and restrain Ukraine, both to the detriment of Israel and Ukraine. So I actually think that my vision for restoring and rebuilding the strength of the U.S.-led order would be very popular among allies. And as I have shared this with people in Poland, Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Britain, people have said that would be a clear-thinking world in which the United States has the confidence to say, yes, the West is worth defending, would be a welcome change. Furthermore, my vision is a world in which the peace that's more restrained is American. I'm against American progressive imperialism. I don't think that the United States should be forcing our allies to take on the most controversial left-wing ideas about marriage and the family. That is far more left-wing than the rest of the world. Maybe one European country would agree with it. It's really not, it's really truly the rest of the world does not have that same vision. So my argument would embrace geopolitical pluralism in the free world. I'm not going to tell Poland how its democracy has to conclude. I'm not going to tell. I'm not going to henpeck India on what it has to do domestically. I'm not going to do that in the vision that I'm laying out. I'm going to look for allies and partners who would agree that their own security and prosperity is going to be in a much better place when the United States is the preeminent power and not China. And I can't think of any country, when really truly given that choice and pressed, would choose China. So that's it. So I completely agree with the assessment of those who say, listen, Germany's not doing enough to defend NATO. And you can go through the list. Canada has been just out to lunch for decades. I mean, you can make all of the, and that's absolutely true, because I remember my vision relies on the collective wealth being put to good use. It's not going to do us any good if we're wealthy and we don't use it. But that's why you need strong, muscular American diplomacy, even with our allies. Reagan understood this. Reagan used a really tough, hard-nosed diplomacy with our allies. And so sometimes U.S. leadership requires delegation. And so we have got to be in a place where this is the golden era of allies. I mean, another thing that we have to reform is our technology exports. AUKUS, this idea that the United States and the UK and Australia are going to collaborate for this security architecture to deter China is great, but only if the United States reforms our technology, our willingness to share key technologies with our allies. That's that pillar 2 of AUKUS. The pillar 1 is about submarines. Pillar 2 is really where the good stuff is. But again, we have to sort of wake up from this slumber since in the post-Cold War and understand that a lot of these regulations and restrictions that we put on, those are luxuries of peace. And we're not really in that time anymore. We're in an era of no kidding rigorous competition for our interests. So it's kind of a long answer to your very articulate short question. Yeah. Here, well, all the way to the back, and then this gentleman here, in the gray suit, is next.
Hi, thank you for being here today. My name is Allison Engel. I'm from Liberty University. I'm so glad that you brought up the point about the way that our international institutions have been corrupted and kind of taken over by the axis of resistance in the world. And I love the idea of leaving the WHO and creating a new international organization in terms of that.
Yeah.
My question would be, given how prominent the UN is on the world stage, I'm especially disappointed with the way we allow ourselves to be treated in the UN, and especially the ways that humanitarian elements have been failing. But given how prominent it is, I'm wondering if you think what a feasible approach to that would be. Is there any way we can reform the UN at this point? Do you think it's feasible to leave the UN? Do you think we're better off creating a new organization or more dealing with our allies one-on-one? What would be your take on the best way to approach that?
So so definitely like the UN Commission on Human Rights has just been, I mean, Nikki Haley was right to withdraw the United States from that. So it kind of depends. It depends on which mechanism within the UN. I think, and to the extent that we determine that this is no longer serving our interests and is in fact undermining our interests, then we should withdraw. But and start a new one. There's nothing that says that it's kind of like if we're not at the table, then we can't influence. But we are not influencing now. So I just reject those two choices. There is another way to go. But again, the United States has to use its elbows to actually say, look, this is a joke that these countries are sitting on the UN Commission on Human Rights. Or the UN Committee on Human Rights, or the various commissions and things, and whenever you see like what the UN has been doing in Lebanon, you have to be willing to call it out. You have to be willing to say, like, look, this is not serving the interests of this international system of which we all say is good for us. So I think it would just depend. It would be specific to what it is. But I mean, if you really want to just see how bad things are at the UN, I mean, really go back and look at, and there were some whisperings going on at the end of the first Trump administration about how much influence China had across the board during the pandemic. Do not forget, regardless of where COVID origins came from, do not forget that the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party amplified the spread of that virus and spread false, slanderous lies about where it came from, what it was doing, that did increase the number of human deaths and prolonged these ridiculous and awful and inhumane lockdowns. I mean, China did that. And we sort of as a country has just memory hold that whole thing. That should be something that the UN should be discussing to get to the bottom. And the Australians tried. The Australians in the middle of the pandemic tried to get to the bottom of UN origins, and then China turned around and sanctioned Australia and said that there are these 14 points that Australia had to meet in order for China to take the sanctions off, 11 of which all had to do with domestic Australian politics. So anybody that says a world order in which China leads and not the United States would be less invasive into the domestic life of democracies, that is baloney. You can look at what the Australians endure. So, yeah, again, it's going to have to take clear eyes and some no kidding resolve to publicly lay out what's been going on. And it probably is going to take having these hard conversations with allies first before going public with them. And there's a way to do that that makes sense. But I would just say we should not have an ideological attachment to these international organizations. They should always be measured against, are they making Americans safer and more secure, or are they not? And that should be the measure.
Rebeccah, thank you.